AI is replacing writing jobs, but not the way you think. Over the past couple of years, tools like ChatGPT have gotten really good really fast. And because of that, there's been a pretty consistent narrative. AI is coming for writing jobs. And if you spend any time on LinkedIn, you're going to see it everywhere. Writers, journalists, and editors, they're watching these tools improve while companies are looking ways to cut costs. And honestly, that makes a lot of sense. But I think that the framing is a little bit off. AI isn't replacing writing jobs across the board, it's doing something a bit different. It's exposing the roles that were already fragile to begin with. How AI exposed a pre-existing trend. Most of the conversation around AI is focused on output, how fast content can be produced, how cheaply it can be generated, how many articles can be replaced. But if you zoom out, this direction isn't new. Newsroom jobs have been declining for years, well before generative AI showed up. According to Pew Research Center, newsroom employment has been trending down since the late 2000s. And you can see the same thing happening at companies like McClatchy. Legacy properties get consolidated, the operations move from print to digital, and content strategies shift towards SEO and volume. So AI didn't really start that trend, it just made it easier to execute. The real shift in writing jobs. When you look into all this, the divide isn't really between humans and AI. It's between two types of roles. On one side, you have production roles. These are your standard writing and editing positions. The goal is to produce more content faster and cheaper. On the other side, you have outcome-driven roles. That focuses on what gets made, why it matters, and how it performs. And those two paths are starting to separate pretty quickly. Take BuzzFeed, for example. Like a lot of companies, they're experimenting with AI to scale content. Things like quizzes and personality posts. And this makes sense. Those formats are predictable. But scaling content doesn't necessarily improve results. And more importantly, there have been questions about how well that approach actually translates into business performance. The real value of content jobs. So where does that leave things? It shifts the advantage towards people who understand how the system works. Not just writing, but how content connects to demand, distribution, and revenue. You can see that shift across the industry. Companies like the New York Times and McClatchy are leaning heavily into digital subscriptions and audience growth. That's where the leverage is now. Staying relevant in an AI-driven writing career. Audit your role for leverage gaps. Start by looking at how your time is actually spent. List your weekly tasks, then split them into two groups: execution work, writing, editing, formatting, and decision-making work, topics, strategy, distribution. If most of your time is spent on execution, that's the high-risk area. For example, in my role, I noticed a steady flow of PR emails asking for editorial coverage. Most of them were ignored. But instead of deleting them, I've reframed them as demand signals. Companies actively looking for exposure. So I responded with a simple template and routed interested companies to the partnerships team. That turned into qualified leads. It's the same inbox but a different lens. And the adjustment here is simple. Spend less time just completing tasks and more time identifying opportunities. Tie your work to a business outcome. Writing on its own isn't enough anymore. You need to understand what your work actually produces. Take one recent piece and ask a simple question. What did this do? Did it drive traffic? Did it generate revenue? Did it support a larger goal? If you don't know, that's the gap. At companies like McClatchy, there's increasing pressure to connect content to measurable outcomes, whether that's subscriptions, engagement, or some type of revenue. That's the direction. So start tracking one metric tied to your work, traffic, conversions, or engagement, and use that data to guide decisions. Focus on what really works. The last piece is probably the most important. There's a lot of advice about building systems, templates, workflows, and pipelines, and that can all be useful, but it's also exactly what AI is getting better at. The real advantage comes from figuring out what actually works in practice. In my case, I worked with affiliate content across existing articles. Some partners were offering higher payouts. In some cases, it was $200 or more per conversion, but they weren't generating any sales. Meanwhile, Row paid less, but actually converted, likely because of brand awareness and advertising. So instead of chasing higher payouts, I focused on what works, and that produced consistent income. AI suggested the higher payout partner, but after seeing Serena Williams promote Row during the Super Bowl, the choice was clear. AI can be a great tool, but human intuition is still superior. The key is to test, measure, and double down on what actually produces results. So overall, AI isn't really the story here. The shift was already happening. AI just sped it up. And if you look at how companies operate, the pattern is pretty consistent. Pure writing roles, especially ones tied to output, are usually the first to get cut when budgets tighten. Not because writing isn't valuable, because it's easier to replace. The risk isn't being a writer. It's being in a role where your only function is to produce content. The people who stick around are tied to outcomes. They connect content to traffic, revenue, and growth. And once your work is tied to results, you're no longer just a cost. You're part of the system that drives the business. And that's much harder to replace. So the goal isn't just to get better at writing, it's to move closer to the outcome. And that's what separates people who get stuck from ones who break out. And that's what we'll get into in the next episode.